Hi guys, and welcome back to SwitchUp. A big thanks for all the new subscribers as we hit 80k, and remember we give away 2 free Nintendo Switch games each and every month to the patron and subscriber most active. Now, Enter the Gungeon was one of my favourite games on the Nintendo Switch. As with these types of games, it was ridiculously difficult but hugely satisfying, with a dodge roll mechanic and tons of different pickups and items and gear, as well as a co-op mode. Now we have Exit the Gungeon, which dropped onto the eShop during the Indie Direct the other day, and with little to no warning into our inbox for review. A big thanks to all of you who follow the channel and enjoy the content. Is it worth exiting this dungeon, or should you just self-isolate? Let's find out. In terms of the storyline, events take place exactly where they left off. That is at the end of the Gungeon, and then you've got the choice of whether to make your way out. The route through which you'll be challenged to do this isn't quite the same, thankfully. This time around, you'll be playing out the game from a side perspective, beginning in an unusual elevator system. As far as the storyline goes, it doesn't really get a huge amount more complex, other than rescuing survivors as you go throughout the game, but more on those later. Now, in terms of the gameplay, it is quite different in its approach compared to the first title. As I mentioned, you're playing from a side perspective, and this adds a lot of new control elements to it. In fact, I mentioned to Glen, it feels much more like the game Pang combined with something like a bullet hell shooter. Rather than finding new items and weapons, new guns are gifted to you depending on the multiplier score that you accumulate throughout the game. Every jump or roll makes you invulnerable to bullet fire, and you'll have the screen clearing blanks, which will eliminate all the fire from the screen. Very similar to most shmups. That's shoot 'em ups, for that person who always asks. As well as being able to roll across the ground and jump up to different levels, you can also jump down below floors as well. And using the right stick, you'll be able to shoot in 360 degrees. Enemies entering the area are telegraphed with a target, which gives you a few precious moments to plan your next move, as dodging those bullets is nigh on impossible at times. However, having this mechanic meant that your brain just had a few seconds to calculate the best possible location to stand and fight. And in all honesty, you won't be doing a great deal of standing. You're constantly on the move, and much like the game Pang Adventures, you'll find yourself almost not looking at your character. You'll have to focus on the center of the screen and use your peripheral vision if you stand any chance of survival in this game. After a few different waves of enemies, you know what's coming next, and it's a boss. The bosses are excellent in all different shapes and sizes, from one who is most definitely inspired by a certain Eggman, or Dr. Robotnik if you're old like me, to a hideously difficult snake and a slightly unfortunate cat. Each one of them's well designed, well implemented, and requires a completely different strategy to defeat. Just when you begin to get comfortable, a boss will come up that is just disgraceful in its difficulty and will send you packing all the way back down to the underdeep. I really did enjoy and grow to love the constantly shifting weapon mechanic. Just when you get comfortable with one that's a bit overpowered, it will suddenly switch to a bubble gun, or one that requires an excessively long charge time, and you'll have to adapt your strategy. And that's where the real addiction came for me. Now, once you clear this first elevator stage, you'll then be treated to a short shopping spree. In here, you can spend some of your hard-earned cash, which is obviously acquired by killing enemies, to either purchase a key for unlocking a trapped comrade later in the game at a cost, or you can spend it on upgrading your character for this run. Usually by the time you reach this shop, you'll have picked up many different items, and some of these will require you to not purchase anything, and if you do, you may actually lose the benefits they offer. You can check all of this in your options, and it's worth keeping an eye on this, as things like the huge health boost are way more important, in my opinion, than upgrading an armor piece which only can take 1 damage. As you can see from the top of the screen, you have your health hearts. Now, each of these can take hits before they're gone, but enemies will occasionally drop health pickups, and there are other things that you can do to mitigate health being an issue, such as the aforementioned armor purchase in the shop if you need it, as well as health revival. Now, thankfully, the game doesn't just stick to the one formula you've seen already. As you progress through the different levels, it introduces a couple of new mechanics. For example, in the second or third floor, it takes on a more choose-your-own arena style, where there's a number of doors which you can choose, but you'll have to beat all of these before you can then face the boss. It was a really welcome change of pace, while keeping the mechanics such as the weapon switching that made the first section so enjoyable. I was really impressed. Now the controls overall are very responsive. You could either use the A, B, X and Y buttons, or you can use the L and R and respective trigger buttons, which I found easier because it meant that I could still control my character, jump, shoot and aim with the right stick without having to take my hand off or do any claw grips. When you do eventually perish, you'll be shown exactly how well you've done, how far you've reached, your score, and you'll have certain tokens and items as well as these, which we'll talk about in a minute. You'll return to the Underdeep, where you can then choose a new character by chatting to one of them down below, and also purchase brand new items and gear that will then be available for the subsequent runs, and these will use those tokens I mentioned before. For me, the main drawback to the title, and one which is a bit unusual if you consider the first game was one of the best co-op experiences on Switch, is the lack of any multiplayer. It seems like a real missed opportunity to me, especially considering how well multiplayer works in this kind of format. You have only to look at Pang Adventures to see a great example of the benefit that it can bring. Other than that though, I can't really think of a huge amount to criticize the game on. I will say that perhaps the different characters could have offered more of a unique play experience. As it is, it doesn't feel that different when you take on a new character. I guess that's for balancing reasons, but I did notice that. In terms of the overall difficulty then, it's still very challenging, but the health mechanic and the amount of hearts you get feels quite reasonable in terms of overall difficulty. Some of the boss fights get understandably tricky, but they've nailed the addictive formula from the first title while adapting it for a slightly new style. Gameplay for me scores 16 out of 20, only taking a slight knock due to the lack of any multiplayer and some more frustrating difficulty spikes. While the controls are excellent overall, but there were a couple of times where it was impossible to avoid damage. Either that or I just need to get good. Still, it's very good controls, and they score 18 out of 20. Looking at the visuals and audio, while they're still good, I don't think they really hold a candle to Enter the Gungeon. The art in that game had a very distinctive charm. They stood out in a sea of pixel art games. It's difficult to put my finger on exactly why that was, whether it was the level of detail or the destructible environments, or even the tables being able to be kicked over. Everything just was really well done. And here in Exit the Gungeon, it's still good, it's not bad at all, it just doesn't really have that same level of quality for me. There's quite a lot of visual repetition, some of the areas are just a touch more drab, and while the enemy and character designs are all decent, it didn't quite reach that same high note. Now that being said, there is a lot good here, such as some very detailed small pixel art animations, which aren't easy to achieve. I noticed this in the tutorial, where you're given a hat. It's very well done, and it's quite clever actually, because it's very tricky. Performance is excellent, as you'd imagine, in both docked and handheld modes, and it's fully Switch Lite compatible. Text is all of a good size, and credit has to go to the many different types of weapon and the unique ways in which they fire. Boss designs are solid, so overall visuals are still decent. Now in terms of the audio, it's very good, it's catchy, the weapon sounds are nice, but it's not outstanding, and there weren't a great deal of tunes that stuck in my memory. Now overall for me, visuals and audio are of a decent quality. I just felt like they could have done more in this area. Visuals score 15 out of 20, while the audio scores 16 out of 20. In terms of the value and game length then, well, you could complete a run in about 2.5 hours, potentially much less than that, depending on how good you are and how many times you die, but to actually gain all the items and unlock all the characters is going to take substantially more time. What you need to know really when getting Exit the Gungeon is that this isn't a sequel to the first title. Don't go in expecting Enter the Gungeon, because it's actually quite a different title. But that being said, if you already know that going in and you're quite happy for something new, I think there's a lot of value to be had here. Perhaps not quite as good a game as Enter the Gungeon, but in its own right it's still excellent. I've probably played for around about 10 hours so far, which isn't a huge amount of playtime, but even in that time I've had a great experience. Although I'm not going to lie, there have been one or two rage quit moments. The randomly bestowed weapon mechanic might not appeal to everyone. Players that are looking for the discovery of new items could potentially find this a little bit off-putting. There is some slight balancing that needs doing with these weapons as well, and equally with the dodge roll mechanic, as to some degree this can end up being spammed to avoid 90% of the damage without really having to think too hard. But as with all things, when you get good at something, you can actually use these skills much more effectively. For me overall, I'd give value 16 out of 20.
The past has been erased. A paradox created. Yet the Gungeon remains.
Overall then, I've really enjoyed Exit the Gungeon's gameplay. I enjoyed Enter the Gungeon, but I was more of a Binding of Isaac kind of a guy, and I'm a big fan of Pang Adventures, so for me, I really loved the formula here. I only wish they could have had a 2-player co-op, as making Glen look pedestrian would have been a real pleasure. I can feel his rage. Right, overall, Exit the Gungeon gets a SwitchUp score of 81%. A big thanks to the developers for the review copy. Please leave a comment down below, let me know what you think of this one. Yes, it was out on Apple Arcade first, but it does fit the Switch really nicely. Do you agree with some of my criticisms, or was I too harsh? Let me know down below. Big thanks to our patrons who support us each and every month. Nice one. And for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys. See ya!